I mean, Matthew's already said that very often it seems that it's self-evident that there are benefits from energy access. And no doubt most of you here have heard at some time in the recent past some statement to the effect that energy access is essential to the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals, and that modern energy services are, if you like, a prerequisite. That's the language that comes from the Millennium Project report, prerequisite to meeting the Millennium Development Goals. And in this International Year of Sustainable Energy for All, you've probably heard these statements more often than before. And certainly I've been doing it myself a little bit. And intuitively, I think, certainly for the people in this room, I imagine that it's pretty obvious, and it's self-evident, as Matthew says, that energy access affects achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. And the assertion that energy access is a good thing and will do this is unquestionable. But we are asking ourselves today, what is the evidence for this? Is there any evidence to support this assertion that allows us to then make confident recommendations and decisions both on policy and practice? Conventionally, assessments of energy investments and energy interventions have been based on a matter of cost assessment, identifying the least cost options, and assuming that the needs and benefits of energy are so essential that we don't need to worry about assessing them, at least quantitatively, or perhaps that the benefits don't differ between the different options, and therefore there's no need to look at them, and we just focus on the cost question. And that obviously has resulted in a whole lot of work around various ways of looking at costs, and particularly, as Kevin Arama was talking about earlier this morning, the whole question of levelized cost analysis. As a result of this focus on the cost part of the equation, descriptions of access to modern energy services tend to be fairly general in nature and little more than a precursor to getting into the costing debate. But given that energy access is a necessary, if not a sufficient, condition for meeting the Millennium Development Goals, and given that the costs of lack of access are so huge in terms of people's health and people's constrained opportunities, I think it is important for us to dig a little bit deeper into how and whether these claimed benefits are actually realized. So what I'm going to do is give you a very, very brief overview in a fairly abstract way, and hopefully raise, as I go along, a few questions about the nature of the evidence. And I'm hoping that Teo is going to complement this with a little bit more concrete examples of how that evidence is generated. But before I get into that, I think it's important also to unpick a little bit the title of the session, and particularly the phrase low carbon energy access. Both the low carbon part and the energy access part are open to differing interpretations, and have been the cause of a lot of angst and debate among various, certainly civil society members, community members, but also have been a cause of confusion sometimes in some of the official debates. For me, energy access means we are talking about the people who are at the base of the pyramid, the people who currently lack access to modern energy services, the 1.4 billion who don't have electricity, and the 2.7 who don't have modern cooking fuels. So we're talking about people who are living in poverty. And it's the benefits of them having access to energy that we want to focus on. However, I think when we get into that, we do need to think about the broader context that those people are living in. And we can look at these benefits to access to modern energy services for the poor in two ways. First at the household level, and then at the broader system or macro level. The phrase low carbon, for me, means renewable. And what we're talking about here is the question about whether or not low carbon energy access generates any benefits. And I think there's a legitimate question to be asked whether the low carbon part makes any difference. In other words, does energy access matter, or is it low carbon energy access? I'll say a little bit more about that later on. Okay, let's focus first of all on the household level benefits. As you all know, all households, and whatever income level they're at, use a range of energy technologies, a range of energy sources for a variety of different purposes, a variety of different services. And these are not all substitutable. So we need to be, when we're unpicking this, be clear about which energy use we're talking about. Broadly, I would say, looking at what has been claimed for the benefits of energy access and what has actually been assessed in terms of the benefits of energy access, there are 5 broad categories. The economic benefits, the health benefits, benefits in terms of education, benefits in terms of gender equality and women's empowerment, and then something that I've very loosely called the psychological benefits, which I'll explain later on. So let's first look at the economic benefits. And here, I think they break down into 3 categories. But first of all, it's worth looking at some of the evidence that does exist. And there is a fairly recent study from Nepal undertaken by UNDP and the Alternative Energy Promotion Center in Nepal, which showed that, looking at off-grid electricity, that the incomes of households who have access to electricity are 25% higher than the incomes of the households who don't. The average level of incomes in the communities that have access to electricity are 25% higher than in the communities that don't have that access. They've got a little bit more evidence and have done some fairly sophisticated analysis, and also concluded that 30% of this difference is accounted for by the access to electricity. And I think the question now for us is how can we explain this? How can we explain how that access to electricity has resulted or helped produce a differential in incomes? Or is it actually happenstance? First of all, I think we've got, as part of the explanation, I think that perhaps the most important element of all of this are the financial savings to households who have access to modern energy services. Low-income households, poor families in developing countries very often spend more than 10%, sometimes nearly double that, on energy. 10% of their income on energy. 10%, by the way, is the UK's measure of energy poverty as well. And so in developing countries, low-income households are spending a very large proportion, a significant proportion of their income on energy. Access to modern energy does enable them to reduce that expenditure, whether it's expenditure on candles or kerosene, fuels, etc., batteries, and so on. The economists amongst you would also then go into sometimes doing if you like, a consumer surplus analysis and provide a sort of theoretical, also additional benefit in terms of consumer surplus, which is the difference between the amount that people are willing to pay and the amount that they actually do. And what is very clear is that at a certain minimum level of electricity consumption, people are willing to pay quite a large amount. Beyond that minimum level, the prices of electricity is very high. In other words, people are very price sensitive in terms of the amount of electricity that they consume. So we've got financial savings to low-income households from access to modern energy services in very many cases. And I think one of the questions for us is well, how is that income, how is that additional income, if you like, used? There is quite a large body of people in the energy sector, who, and certainly in the commercial world, who see that income saved as being the potential market for modern energy appliances. So the savings on wood fuel or kerosene or candles would be used to pay for the higher quality electricity service that's provided by the modern energy appliances. And I think there is another question there, is whether or not that is the most developmental impact that we will be looking for, or whether or not these reduced expenditures could be spent on other aspects of the household's livelihoods and livings. There are also savings in terms of the opportunity costs of time, the most obvious being in terms of women's and girls' time collecting firewood. Improved efficiency in cooking quite often reduces the amount of time required for cooking. And again, we have the question of how is that freed up time going to be used? How is it being used? Do we know enough about all of that? Certainly there's some evidence to say that girls who are freed from having to collect firewood are more likely to be attending school. But what about the time that their mothers have got freed up from collecting firewood, and how is that going to be? And very often the claim or the assertion is that it is going to be used for productive activities. But do we know this? The third element of the economic benefits for the household are in terms of production. And this breaks down, I think, also into three elements. First of all, improved productivity in existing economic activities, improved processing power, in better time, etc., in terms of efficiency of processing. Extended working hours, having light in the evening allows people to do things that they might not have been able to do otherwise in the evenings. And then thirdly, new economic opportunities. There is quite often in some of the statements that you hear a claim that the provision of electricity, providing access to electricity, is going to open up a whole new range of economic opportunities for low-income households and low-income communities. But I think we need to be careful about hearing these claims, and I think we need to question some of them. The same as Paul's study that I mentioned, for instance, revealed that only 3% of the households actually took up new opportunities using the modern electricity service that they now had. More interestingly, and this is substantiated by some other studies I've seen, is quite often that the increased number of economic activities, small enterprises, business opportunities, etc., quite often takes a period of several years to materialize in any significant number. So claims that access to modern electricity services are going to revitalize and generate huge, great additional economic activities in low-income communities, I think is an area that deserves further scrutiny. Let's move to the health benefits now. On the health side, there's a fairly obvious improved health status, particularly for women and girls, from reduced indoor air pollution and from reduced drudgery and burden of collecting firewood. There's also indirect benefits in terms, particularly when we're talking about electricity, of improved health services by health facilities having access to refrigeration and lighting. But again, we need to ask ourselves to what extent this really happens, and is this reflected in the health indicators. At the education level, we've got improved school attendance. The Paul study again showed that more time being spent by households, by children in households who have access to electricity, being spent on educational activities. And one that has cropped up certainly in the claims side very often, but now substantiated by this Paul study, is that the ability for poor communities to attract teachers to stay in their communities improves the ratio of pupils to teachers. Gender equality and women's empowerment. again, there's the general improved health status of women that enables them to function and perform better. Evidence that they have improved access to information that enables them to make more informed decisions and be able to engage better. And also some more time for social interaction, which enables them to have perhaps a greater say in the way that their communities are run. However, I think we again also need to be careful about some of the claims made here. For instance, there's one study I saw recently which claimed that access to modern energy services did strengthen women's empowerment. However, when you look a bit more carefully, it was the women's engagement and the savings and credits scheme associated with that energy service, rather than the energy service itself, that generated those improvements. Finally, the psychological benefits, which I think is a sort of general sense of well-being that you quite often can encounter. Certainly a general sense when there's more lighting in the evening in a community about safety, and a sense of connectivity with the rest of the world, and a sense of people being, if you like, part of the modern world, whereas without electricity in particular, they were not. And I don't think we should underestimate these less tangible benefits. Does it make any difference whether or not this energy is provided by low carbon or not? When it comes to electricity, I think the key factor is whether it's a cost question, basically. Is the electricity low carbon going to be lower cost or higher cost than the alternative? And we know, certainly for many rural and remote communities, low carbon energy does tend to be lower cost. But that's not necessarily going to be the same everywhere. When it comes to modern cooking services, we know that biogas, for instance, or even or LPG also reduces indoor air pollution. And I think the question here is going to be whether or not what are the options open to people for alternatives. And again, it'll be a question of cost as much as the availability of the options. Let's move quickly to the macro level. Again, you can look at the sort of macro level or national level benefits in the same categorization as you can for a household, and you can aggregate up. I think when you do aggregate up, there become more attribution questions in terms of how much of a particular kind of benefit you can attribute to energy or not. But again, briefly, we can also identify potentially growth benefits. We know that growth is correlated with energy. We know that GDP per capita is correlated with energy access. But does energy access for the poor have any influence on growth? I'll ask you to answer that question. There are employment benefits potentially. Irina, some of you will have seen, have put out a report recently that is explaining the employment benefits of renewable energy technologies. And there's some evidence to say that renewable energy technologies, particularly off-grid type technologies, generate more employment in the provision of the energy services. But we also know that improved productivity from energy access and so on can potentially reduce employment in some activities. So it's not as clear-cut an equation as some people would like to make out. At the national level, though, I think that the low-carbon bit does play a little bit more important in our thinking. First of all, in terms of energy security, where if there's more renewable energy being used, there's less dependence on imports and less vulnerability to variability in particularly oil prices. Renewable energy potentially could release up the vast amount of money that's used to subsidize fossil fuels. And there is then a question of whether or not actually some of those subsidies could be diverted to promote renewable energy technologies. There are the environmental benefits, obviously, in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the use of renewable energies. But let's remember that for low-income households, the people that we're particularly interested in, or the people that I'm particularly talking about, per capita emissions are already very low. And when they increase their energy consumption to the levels that they might when they have energy access, their per capita emissions are still going to be very low. And it's a question of whether or not the additional greenhouse gas emissions from energy consumption by low-income households makes much difference to national greenhouse gas emissions, and certainly it's almost insignificant when it comes to global greenhouse gas emissions. So, to sum up, I think we know pretty much the nature of the benefits of energy access. I think there are lots of questions in terms of whether or not these claimed benefits are realized. There is a certain degree of an evidence base. There are more cost-benefit type analysis appearing, but quite often they're quite narrow in scope, either a particular community, particular project, particular country. A lot of other assessments tend to be qualitative and anecdotal. Some of the quantitative assessments that have been done are based on models and scenarios rather than empirical measurement. And I think that there is a need for a much more effort to if you like, to use the Spanish word, systematización of this evidence base, to bring it together and draw lessons more generally from it. There are problems in terms of different methodologies being used, there are problems in terms of different terminologies and definitions being used. And there may be some scope for us to think about how we can harmonize some of that. But as I say, I think the self-evident nature of the benefits, I think, is substantiated. The actual quantification of those benefits and the interaction between those benefits and other aspects of development, I think, is still a subject for us to explore further. Thank you.